Two rivers meet below this bluff, and everything you can see was arranged by that meeting. The roads, the bridges, the fort on the point, the capital city downstream, the farms that became suburbs. All of it is an argument about water. Today we follow that argument from the confluence outward, through Mendota Heights and Eagan and into St. Paul. Not a tour of monuments, a tour of the rivers that put the monuments where they are. We are in the eastern Twin Cities of Minnesota, in the United States, at the place where the Mni River empties into the Mississippi. The high ground on the south bank is Mendota Heights in Dakota County. East of us lies Eagan. Across the water and downstream lies St. Paul, the state capital. The Mississippi here is barely a third of the way through its journey, and it is already the reason people are here. Look at the two rivers and you notice something wrong. The Mississippi arrives in a narrow, steep, hard-walled gorge. The Minnesota arrives in a valley so wide and so flat that it feels like a mistake, a broad green trench several kilometers across carrying a river that is far too small for it. That mismatch is the oldest fact in this landscape, and it is the key to everything else. The valley was not made by this river. The story starts with ice. During the last glaciation, lobes of the Laurentide ice sheet ground across what is now Minnesota, and when they finally began to withdraw, they left an enormous body of meltwater trapped against the retreating ice front. Geologists call it glacial Lake Agassiz. At its greatest extent, it was larger than all of today's Great Lakes combined, spread across the Dakotas, Minnesota, Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. A lake that size has to drain somewhere. Around 11,700 years ago, one of its main southern outlets broke open and poured out across the land. That outflow has a name. Geologists call it Glacial River Warren, and it was a river of a kind nobody alive has ever seen. It ran for centuries, on and off, as the ice front shifted, and it cut the valley we are looking into right now. Picture it honestly. Not a flood in the ordinary sense, but a sustained torrent, kilometers wide, grinding down through glacial till and then into the bedrock beneath, hauling boulders like gravel. It carved the entire Mni River Valley from the western prairie to this confluence. Everything green and quiet in that trench below us is the floor of a drained catastrophe, softened by 11,000 years of grass and cottonwood and silt. When Lake Agassiz finally found other outlets to the north, the torrent shut off. What was left in the Great Valley was a modest, meandering prairie river, the Minnesota, sliding along the bottom of a channel it could never have dug. Geologists have a plain term for that, an underfit stream. It is one of the clearest examples anywhere on the continent, and you can read it from any high point along this bluff line without any instruments at all. River Warren left one more signature. Where it dropped over a ledge of hard limestone near what is now downtown St. Paul, it created a waterfall, and that waterfall ate backwards. Falling water scoured out the soft sandstone underneath. The limestone cap collapsed in slabs, and the falls retreated upstream, year after year, for thousands of years. That retreating waterfall is the reason the Mississippi runs through a gorge here and nowhere else along its length. The falls eventually split at the confluence. One branch died out a few kilometers up the Minnesota Valley when it met older, buried rock. The other kept walking up the Mississippi, roughly 8 miles over some 9,600 years, until a French friar named Louis Hennepin came upon it in 1680 and named it the Falls of St. Anthony. The gorge between here and those falls is the trench that waterfall left behind it. The rock itself is older than any of this by an almost absurd margin. These bluffs are layered marine sediment, laid down in shallow tropical seas roughly 500 million years ago in the Ordovician and Cambrian. A hard limestone lit over a pale, crumbling sandstone. The whole drama of the ice and the flood was simply the discovery of a weakness that had been waiting in the rock since long before anything with a backbone walked on land. Now the human part, and it begins with a Dakota word. This confluence is Bdote. In the Dakota language, the word describes a place where two waters come together, and while it can be used of other junctions, this one, where the Minnesota joins the Mississippi, is the Bdote that matters most. For Dakota people, it is not a scenic overlook. It is a place of origin, and it is sacred, and it is not a thing of the past. Dakota oral tradition holds that the first people were formed here, at Bdote, from the earth itself, and that the spirits of the people traveled down the road of stars we call the Milky Way to arrive at this ground. The Mississippi in Dakota is Wakpatonka, the Great River. The wooded island lying in the fork of the two rivers is at the heart of it. Rivers and people have come together at this junction for something like 10,000 years. The land around us is Mni Sota Makoce, the Dakota homeland. The state took its name from that phrase, from the Dakota description of water that carries a cloudy, sky-tinted light. The Dakota are here now. Their communities and their governments exist in the present tense, in this state and beyond it, and members come back to Bdote continually. We move through a homeland, not a memorial, and it is worth saying that plainly before we go any further. The rivers were the roads and the larder. The valley bottoms gave fish, waterfowl, deer, turtles, mussels, and the shelter of floodplain forest. Northward in the shallow lakes, wild rice. Bark canoes moved on this water long before any keelboat did, and the trails along these bluffs were being used when the ford on the point was not even an idea. Everything the newcomers later called a discovery was, in fact, already a route. Just up on the Mississippi side, there is a spring that has run continuously for as long as anyone can document. In Dakota, it is Mni Owe Sni, Cold Water Spring. It is a sacred place to the Dakota and to other tribes, and in 2023 it was formally listed on the National Register of Historic Places as a traditional cultural property. Long before it was any of that, it was simply reliable water, which in this country is the same as life. The United States Army found the spring convenient too. Soldiers building the fort camped beside it, then hauled water from it by wagon, then piped it. And in the 1880s, the Army built a proper waterworks there, a stone spring house and a reservoir. By the 1920s, the fort had switched to city water and the waterworks decayed. The National Park Service has since cleared the site and restored prairie, savanna, and woodland around the water. Europeans reached this confluence by boat because there was no other way to reach it. French traders came first, working the fur routes out of Canada, and the Dakota met them on Dakota terms. The trade ran on relationships, on intermarriage, on debt and obligation, for well over a century before any flag was planted here. The river was the highway, and for a long time whoever controlled the river simply asked permission to use it. Then the fur companies consolidated. By the 1830s, the American Fur Company ran this district, and the confluence was its northern hinge. Bales of pelts came downriver, trade goods came up, and the ledgers of debt owed by Dakota hunters to traders grew steadily heavier. Those ledgers are not a footnote. They will turn up again decisively when the treaties are signed, and they are one of the reasons the treaties turned out the way they did. In 1805, a young Army officer named Zebulon Pike came up the Mississippi and met Dakota leaders at the island in the fork of the rivers. He obtained a document ceding land at the confluence for a fort. Pike himself noted the tract was worth perhaps $200,000. The treaty as written contained no sum at all. The United States Senate later inserted $2,000 without consulting the Dakota, and the president never proclaimed it. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. A document with a blank where the price should be. A figure written in afterwards in Washington by people who were not there. A signature from only two of the Dakota leaders present. This is not a scandal that historians uncovered later. It is on the face of the record. And on the strength of that paper, an army came upriver and built a stone fort on this bluff. Troops arrived in 1819 under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Leavenworth. Colonel Josiah Snelling took over the following year and drove the construction. They built in local limestone, a diamond-shaped work with a round tower on the point, finished by 1825. It was first called Fort St. Anthony. The War Department renamed it Fort Snelling. For decades, it was the northwestern edge of the United States Army, a stone argument set down at the junction of two rivers. The fort was a garrison, a courthouse, a hospital, a market, and a customs post all at once. It was also quietly a slave-holding place. Slavery was illegal in this territory. Officers brought enslaved people here anyway, and the army did not stop them. That contradiction sat inside the walls for years, and it is the reason a name known to every American law student belongs, in part, to this bluff above the Mni Sota River. Harriet Robinson was enslaved by Lawrence Taliaferro, the federal Indian agent at the fort. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, was brought here by an army surgeon named John Emerson. They married at Fort Snelling in the mid-1830s, in a civil ceremony that itself implied a status the law denied them. They later sued for their freedom on the grounds that they had lived here, on free soil, and that suit reached the Supreme Court. In 1857, the court ruled against them and held that Black Americans could not be citizens. It is remembered as one of the worst decisions the court has ever issued, and it helped push the country into civil war. The chain of events that produced it runs straight back through this ground. Free soil, in practice, was only as free as the people with power on it chose to make it. Below the fort, on the Minnesota side, sits Mendota. The name is an anglicization of the Dakota word for the confluence itself. It is often called the oldest permanent settlement of Europeans in Minnesota, and the reason is a limestone house built in the mid-1830s for Henry Hastings Sibley, regional manager of the American Fur Company. It is considered the oldest private residence still standing in the state. Sibley would later become Minnesota's first governor. The Sibley house was raised from blocks quarried nearby by a crew of white and Dakota laborers, and it became the fur company's headquarters for this district. In 1910, it opened to the public, the first designated historic site in Minnesota. It stands there still, low and thick-walled, a merchant's house facing a river. Everything the fur trade did in this country was decided in rooms about that size. Above Mendota rises a hill the Dakota call Oheyawahe, which is usually translated as a hill much visited. Steamboat pilots later used its profile as a landmark and called it Pilot Knob. It is a burial place, a council place, and a place of ceremony for the Dakota, and Dakota people who died at Fort Snelling were buried on it. In 1851, on this hill, the Treaty of Mendota was signed. That treaty, and its companion signed at Traverse des Sioux the same summer, transferred an enormous area of Dakota land, on the order of 24 million acres, to the United States. Much of the money owed was diverted straight to traders to settle those old ledgers. What remained for the Dakota was a narrow reservation strip along the Mni Sota River, and even that was cut back afterwards. Minnesota became a state 7 years later on that land. Then annuities came late, food was withheld, hunger set in, and in the summer of 1862 war broke out along the Mni River. It lasted about 6 weeks. Hundreds died, settlers and Dakota both. The United States tried hundreds of Dakota men in trials that lasted minutes each. President Lincoln commuted most of the sentences. 38 men were hanged at Mankato on the 26th of December, 1862, the largest mass execution in American history. And then this place below us. More than 1,600 Dakota people, mostly women, children, and the elderly, many of whom had taken no part in the fighting, were marched here and held through the winter of 1862 and 63 in a stockaded camp on the river flats beneath the guns of the fort. There was little food and little shelter. Disease moved through the camp. More than 300 of them died there. In May of 1863, the survivors were loaded onto steamboats and shipped away, most of them to Crow Creek in Dakota Territory, a place then gripped by drought. Dakota people were legally exiled from Minnesota. They came back anyway over decades, and today 4 Dakota communities are recognized in this state. This is not a story that ended. It is a story people are still living, and Bdote is still their center. We carry that with us downstream. The river turns and runs on towards St. Paul, and the character of the land changes with it. The bluffs stay high, but the flats widen, and the barges start appearing. This is the working Mississippi now. Everything from here on is a story about a landing, because in the middle of the 19th century, a landing was the only thing that could turn a patch of riverbank into a city. And there was exactly one good landing left. St. Paul begins with a bootlegger. Pierre Parent, a one-eyed trader with a reputation nobody defends, was pushed off the military reserve and set up a whiskey shop downriver in the late 1830s. He was nicknamed Pig's Eye, and the settlement that grew around him was called Pig's Eye Landing. Then in 1841, a French priest, Lucien Galtier, put up a small log chapel on the bluff above and dedicated it to St. Paul. Galtier did not care for the old name. He asked that the place be called St. Paul instead, after the chapel, and the landing below it became St. Paul's Landing, and the name spread outward until it covered the whole settlement, and then the capital of a state. A bootlegger and a priest, in that order. It is a very honest origin story, and the city has never entirely managed to shake off either half of it. But the real reason St. Paul exists is the falls upstream. St. Anthony Falls blocked steamboats. That made this stretch of riverbank the practical head of navigation on the Mississippi, the furthest north a paddle steamer could reliably reach. Everything and everyone coming into the territory came ashore here, at the lower landing and the upper landing. Regular steamboat service ran down to Galena in Illinois from the 1840s. The city was, quite literally, the end of the river. South and east of the confluence lies Eagan, and its story is quieter. The township was organized in 1860 and took its name from Patrick Eagan, an Irish immigrant from County Tipperary who chaired the first board of supervisors and farmed a couple of 100 acres near what became the town hall. Irish and German families broke the land here. For a long stretch of the 20th century, Eagan grew onions in commercial quantity and called itself the onion capital of the country. The valley that River Warren cut is a difficult thing to cross, and for most of the 19th century you crossed it by ferry between Mendota and the fort. Then, in 1926, the Mendota Bridge opened. 13 concrete rib arches, over 4,000 feet end to end. When it opened, it was the longest continuous concrete arch bridge in the world. It was dedicated to Minnesota artillerymen killed in the First World War. The land at the confluence is protected now, twice over. Fort Snelling State Park was set in motion by the legislature in 1961 and opened the following year, and in 1988 Congress created the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, a 72-mile corridor of river through these cities. Bald eagles nest in the floodplain cottonwoods. Herons work the backwaters. The valley that a catastrophe cut has turned into one of the richest wildlife corridors in the region. So here is the argument finished. Ice made a lake. The lake broke out and cut a valley. The valley made a confluence, and the confluence made a sacred center, and then a fort, and then a treaty, and then a wound that has not closed. A waterfall walked upstream and left a gorge, and where it started, a landing became a capital. Every human decision here was made in the shape the water had already prepared. The rivers do not care about any of it. They keep moving the same silt they have moved for 11,000 years, past the fort, past the island, past the landings, on toward the sea. But it is worth knowing what happened on their banks and worth naming it honestly, including the parts that are hard to say out loud. Thank you for watching. Follow for more trails of the world.